Okay, now we're returning to module number 6. Again, my name is Jim Craven. My Blackfoot name is Omachko Kiaipoi. Let's continue on our discussion. We said before that one way around treaties is to break one of the parties of the treaty as a sovereign, or attempt to break them as a sovereign nation and co-equal and treaty partner. Remember something. Treaties require consideration. That means something for something. That means each side has given up something for something else. So, for example, when we talk about killing members of the group, according to the terms of the treaty, each side is supposed to be protected from violence by the other side. That's why the treaty was signed, was for peace. The Lakota treaties, the Blackfoot treaties were about peace and war, as well as about property rights. Okay? Because they were at war, and in some cases, by the way, some of the settlers were losing those wars. They weren't always winning. And so, this side received something real. Peace and war, recognition of their own status as a nation, in return for something else. So, for example, when we talk about killing members of the group, throughout the history of virtually every Indian nation I can think of, certain members of that group were targeted for assassination, for being removed to prisons under trumped up charges. Anybody who was asserting that they were still part of a sovereign nation and insisting upon the terms of those treaties being kept. Many of the leadership, particularly, for example, in the American Indian movement, going back to the late 60s and early 70s up to Wounded Knee, there was a calculated campaign called COINTELPRO. I happen to have been one of their targets at one time. And COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, was literally about planting evidence, terrorizing, assassinating leadership in various Indian nations, as well as membership in the American Indian movement. And by the way, other groups, not just the American Indian movement, I might add. Where two of my close friends were assassinated, were murdered, who were tribal activists. So killing members of the group doesn't mean you're killing the whole group. You know, they wanted the whole group alive to become farm workers, maids, ditch diggers. That's what they were being trained for in the Indian schools. They weren't being trained to be scientists or doctors. They were Indians. And so the targeting has always been certain members of the group. That's why the definition of genocide does not require killing everybody in the group. Genocide rarely occurs that way. Causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. Think about that for a minute. For example, how would you feel about having to prove how much Caucasian you are, how much African American you are? For example, in the old days, if you had even one drop of black blood in you, you were called what? You were called black. No matter how you looked, you were called a Negro or colored or whatever, even if you looked white. But Indians, to be federally registered, have to show 25% blood quantum from a particular group. There are Indians right now who are, quote, full-bloods, who are not federally registered because they can't make 25% from any one group. I know such people, by the way, because they're mixed Crow, Blackfoot, Shoshone, Grovon, and so on, because they're mixtures, because, you know, Indians are mixtures like anybody else, from different cultures and so on. So under the rule, and let me quote it to you, Set the blood quantum at 1/4. Hold to it as a rigid definition of Indians. Let intermarriage proceed, and eventually Indians will be defined out of existence. When that happens, the federal government will be finally freed from its persistent Indian problem. End quote. That was on a BIA document, quoted by Patricia Lamarck in her book, The Legacy of the West, page 338, just so you know. Go ahead.
That was when the BIA was defined as underneath the Department of War.
Correct. Correct.
So that was like, that would be like the CIA being within a reservation.
Correct.
It was just the BIA.
Right. But you see, Adolf Eichmann could have written that. Set the blood quantum. First of all, there's no such thing as blood quantum. There's not a Blackfoot gene or a Lakota gene. It's bad biology. Okay? Indians have never played the blood quantum game, except when it was forced on them in order to divide and rule, to set the bloods against the breeds. And on many Indian reservations, you'll still find that division to this very day, bloods versus breeds. Okay? And by the way, we're not making an indictment here of everybody who's ever served on a tribal council. Okay? There are people who serve on tribal councils who mean well, they're honest people, they figure they're working within the system they've got to work in, and they're doing what they can. But our experience has been that most of the tribal councils we've seen are controlled, and they're composed of people who are controllable by the BIA and by the Department of the Interior. Again, it's not an indictment of everybody, but most of the tribal councils we've seen are rotten and corrupt, and they're used to divide and rule, and they're used to impose their rule. Deliberately inflicting upon a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Again, do we have to have tapes showing them this is what we're doing to the Indians? No, we don't need that. In law, there's a basic principle that people are assumed to intend the reasonable, foreseeable consequences of our action. That means that when you start using Indian reserves as toxic waste sites, any reasonable, prudent person with an IQ over room temperature knows what? That it will cause serious conditions that they wouldn't want to live under. They wouldn't want their children to live under. We're talking poisoned water. Go to any reserve. Nobody sane that can afford it doesn't drink bottled water. Because you can't drink tap water on most reserves I've ever been on. You don't dare. It's full of poison, it's full of lead, you can taste it. So the stores there do booming business in bottled water. And so, again, we're talking about the conditions that, take a look at this, the life expectancy for an American Indian male in the United States is around 44 years old. It is around 46 years old for an American Indian female, res-based. That compares with around 76 years old for a white American male, life expectancy, and now 81 years old for a white female, life expectancy. So we have almost about a little bit more than half the life expectancy of whites, male and female. And in fact, the life expectancy in the United States for American Indians on reserves and reservations is lower than Ghana's. Okay, it's lower than many countries in the third world. And next, imposing measures to prevent births within the group. I mentioned to you Ward Churchill's Fantasies of the Master Race, where he documents 40% of American Indian women having been sterilized in the fecund age period. That means from 15 up to about 40, which is the childbearing age group. 40%, and most of them had no idea that they had been sterilized. They would pass it off as a gynecological problem. That data came from inside the BIA itself. 1973, 73 I believe it was, before Wounded Knee. The Russell Means and members of the American Indian Movement raided a BIA office, U.S. government office at Pine Ridge, and absconded with a whole bunch of documents. Oh, DC, excuse me, my mistake, yeah, in DC. But they also did one in Pine Ridge, remember that? That was a little bit earlier. Yeah, the one that I'm talking about now, it was in Washington, DC. They hit BIA offices and got a whole load of documents, made copies of them, and distributed them out everywhere. In those documents, from inside the BIA itself, they found evidence of a campaign of sterilization of Indian children on the reserves. In other words, this isn't something we imagine in our heads. We have hardcore documents, which we will be bringing to you in this series, from the US government, laying out their intentions for everything we're talking about here. We can prove what's called mens rea, in other words, intention, okay? And so we're talking sterilization. What does that mean? That the future is the children. If you're sterilizing 40% of fecund woman, it means you intend what? You intend to prevent the future young people, the ones who will carry on that nation. Because you don't have a nation without people. You don't have a culture without people, because people make and are the carriers of culture. So when you impose measures, sterilization, or when you transfer children from one group to another, in Canada and the United States, it was against the law for Indian parents to withhold their children from being sent to missionary schools and boarding schools. It was a felony not to allow your children to be taken in the middle of the night, their names changed, their hair cut, their traditional clothing removed, beaten for saying their prayers, beaten for speaking their own native language, sent to schools in the middle of nowhere. Imagine that. They come to grab your kids, and you have no idea where those kids are going and what's going to happen to those kids and who these people are who are grabbing them. And in fact, even today, the abuses that have taken place in the Indian residential schools are massive. Sexual abuse, for which there's been no accounting by the Catholic and by the other churches. Torture, using children for medical experiments. For example, Hep B vaccine, they used Indian kids. Going back to the 1940s, there's evidence of using Indian children for mind control experiments. Indian children were used in the LSD experiments of the CIA, MK Ultra. They took street kids, Indian children, and used them for mind control experiments off the street and for LSD experiments and others. This was done by Ewing Cameron in Canada under the CIA's MK Ultra program. This is not conspiracy theory I'm making up. Please believe this. These are hardcore documented facts which we will bring to you. Okay? So Indian children were not only transferred from their homelands to these schools that were situated in the middle of nowhere. And why were they in the middle of nowhere? So that children couldn't escape, and so that the good Christians would not know, or at least have direct proof of what was going on in their name in those schools. These were religious schools. These were subcontractors in genocide. So the point is, genocide isn't all of these things. Any one of these acts constitutes genocide. Genocide is a matter of facts on the ground and law. Just as nationhood, what is a nation, is a matter of facts on the ground and law, not a matter of preference, not a matter of whether you recognize it or not. Think about, for example, right now in the United Nations, some 203 nations in the UN. The UN started out in 1945 with 52 nations. So in other words, the largest majority of nation states that have been recognized and added to the United Nations did so after 1945. They were nations all along. Even when they weren't recognized as nations, they were nations. Because the facts on the ground and the law ultimately what mandated that they be recognized as such, whether anyone liked it or not. And so genocide doesn't come because one group of people has a thing for another group of people. People acquire racist attitudes and genocidal attitudes because they have interests that they're rationalizing and trying to cover up. They don't just, nobody's born hating Indians. That's an acquired taste. And usually hatred comes after, not before, interests that are perceived to be threatened. And after those interests have been held. Then you need a rationale, because what are all those good Christians, why would all these good Christians be doing stuff like this? Where in the Bible does it sanction killing, bodily mental harm, conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole and part, sterilization, and grabbing and kidnapping children and dragging them out in the middle of the night? Which part of the Bible would sanction that? Which part of the Sermon on the Mount would cover that? And so, it's important to understand that genocide, just like nations, just like history itself, do not just come out of the air someday. They don't just fall from the sky. Genocide is built up historically, and there are concrete interests behind it. And what genocide is really about is not just peace and war. What it's really about is this: property rights. How do you now, if I steal from you, I've got the problem that you can, whatever I did to you, I have just given what? I've just given precedent, I've just given license for you to do the same to me. However I stole your property, your land, your house, however I did that, you can do the same or worse to me to get it back. Unless what? Unless somehow I can lawfully acquire or assert and defend these property rights. In other words, as long as what was once stolen property now is legal title. Because why? Because I've managed to what? I've managed to abolish one of the parties to a treaty, thus leaving either the treaty null and void, or leaving one party to speak for both parties of a treaty. Like your landlord now is the only authority over your contract. You have no rights. You're not even considered a tenant anymore. The landlord now controls the terms on himself, as well as respect for the terms on your end of the contract. What's wrong with that picture? And that's exactly what's being done. And you have to understand, that, and this is really important, genocide is not about a few bad people. There's that too. Okay? Genocide is not about just bigotry and prejudice, because bigotry and prejudice doesn't just fall from the sky one day. Peoples are bigots and people are prejudiced because they have vested interest in being exactly that. In denying the humanity of another group of people. Well, why would you deny the humanity of another group of people? Unless what? Unless you were intent on exploiting them. Unless you were intent on what? Imposing upon them all these kinds of conditions, so that also they are no longer people. In other words, if the original discoverers of America weren't people, therefore they're not a real nation. Therefore, the treaties that the U.S. government signed with them are no longer in effect. Even if they were once a nation, they are no longer a nation. Therefore, the treaty doesn't exist, because only treaties exist and kept between nations. If one of them ceases to be a nation, then what? Either the treaty no longer exists, or one party has now what? Assumed standing and authority for both parties to the treaty. That doesn't make any sense. This country was founded on genocide. This country was founded on theft. Not just in Indian terms, but in Christian terms, in Western law terms, in terms of Western codes of property rights terms. This country and Canada and others like it, wherever there are Indigenous people, were built on what? They were built on abrogation of treaties. They were built on genocide. They were built on theft. They were built on power. They were not built on free co-equal exchange between two nations forming a treaty with each side responsible for what? Keeping their terms, the terms they signed to the treaty, and for Indian nations to keep their terms. According to Daniel Inouye, Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii, many years chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs. According to Daniel Inouye, the United States government signed some 800 treaties between the US government and various Indian nations. According to Inouye, the United States ratified 374, some people say up to 403 treaties were ratified by the US government. There's a dispute on some of them whether they were fully ratified. But according to Senator Inouye, and I'm going to finish this segment with this comment. According to Senator Inouye, the Indian nations kept the terms of all 800 treaties, all of them. And according to Senator Inouye, all 374 up to 403 treaties that were ratified by the US Senate, which means they become now part of the supreme law of the land, Article 6, Section 2. All of those treaties were broken and abrogated by the US government unilaterally. According to Senator Inouye, who, by the way, had read and reviewed all 800 treaties as well as all of these treaties that had been ratified. And his statement is, Indians kept the terms of all the treaties, even the ones that had not been ratified by the US government. And the US government violated and abrogated every single ratified treaty that they signed. This will end Module 6. Thank you very much.